Okay, in this screencast, we're going to talk about gene variations. What's the source? Where do these variations come from? Referred to as the raw material of evolution. Okay, Darwin's theory of evolution uses natural selection as the process in which evolution happens. His first step is that there's overproduction of offspring and that those offspring have genetic variation. And some of them have useful variations that are called adaptations. Well, where do useful variations come from? What creates a useful variation? Mutations in DNA. Remember that a mutation in DNA is simply a change in the letters of the DNA. You could have just a single change, you could have addition of letters, you could have deletion of letters, you could cause the chromosomes to flip around. Those are all mutations in DNA. But what's important to understand is the vast majority of genetic mutations are harmful, or they simply have no impact on the organism whatsoever. If the mutations happen in the so-called junk DNA, there may be no physical manifestations of that mutation. The majority of the time, mutations are either harmless or harmful. It's very rare, however, that there might be a mutation that offers some sort of survival or reproductive advantage to the organism. When that happens, that animal or that plant is then healthier and better able to reproduce, and then they leave behind that genetic variation. So a really important question, and this is just one specific question, but that all students of evolution ask, and evolutionary biologists are still having a hard time answering, is if these mutations are in fact random, how do things as complex as something as, say, an eye, how can they evolve from just random mutations when we know that the majority of mutations are harmful mutations? Well, there's not easy answers for that. I'm going to suggest that you click on any of the videos below. They're all hot links, and you can watch the one that talks about the evolution of the eye or any of the other links, just to get a sense of what scientists think the answers are to these. But trust me that there are no easy answers. Now, to switch gears just slightly, I'm going to introduce the concepts of gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. When Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, he predicted that we would find in the fossil record many transition fossils that show how one species gradually changed into another. And that is called gradualism, when big changes occurred due to the accumulation of many small changes. And he predicted that we would find transition fossil after transition fossil. The problem with gradualism is that paleontologists are not finding as many transitional fossil forms as Darwin had predicted. So there were some scientists, we'll mention in just a second, who came up with another theory to explain why we don't find as many transition fossils as originally predicted. We often see these species appearing suddenly in the rock layers. What could be the explanation for that? And that's where we're going to get to with punctuated equilibrium. Okay, in 1972, two very famous evolutionary biologists came up with a proposal to explain why we're not finding as many transition fossils as Darwin had initially predicted. Their idea is called punctuated equilibrium, and basically what they said was sudden, sometimes dramatic changes would be followed by long periods of stasis where things were staying the same. So something was causing a huge amount of genetic change in a short period of time, and then things remain relatively constant after that. So we're not seeing a slow change in evolution, we're seeing sudden changes in evolution. Here's the quote: an evolutionary spurt, natural selection on previously accumulated mutations preceding a longer period of morphological stasis, blah, blah, a lot of fancy words, would explain why paleontologists find so few transitions in the fossil record of a species. So in essence, what they're saying here is that mutations aren't gradually adding up. Mutations happen suddenly in a burst, and then there's not very many mutations for a time. The question is why, and what would cause this sudden dramatic change in an organism's morphology, their shape? What would cause that sudden change and then allow them to remain the same for a long period of time? We'll get to that. So how is it possible for tiny random mutations to lead to these dramatic mutations or these dramatic changes that Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, I think that's his name, were proposing? All right, there is, this is just one possible answer, and scientists and biologists are researching many other possible answers. So this is just one. It turns out we've located some genes that are referred to as Hox and MAP genes, and they might give us a partial answer to these dramatic changes. Homeotic genes, also called Hox genes, are genes that specify what structures are going to develop and where they're going to develop in an organism and how. For instance, they're going to determine which part of the body grows an arm and what form the arms take. These are master controlling genes. And if you mutate a homeotic or a Hox gene, you cause a whole series of other genes to be affected because the Hox gene is in charge of all these other genes. So by changing a Hox gene, you change perhaps where the arm forms or what form that arm actually takes. Let me give you an example. All right, this is a pretty dramatic example that researchers found. So the question says, what might Hox genes have to do with evolution? It might explain sudden bursts in evolution. And I want you to take a look at this photo. This is a normal fruit fly, and it has normal, the one on top has normal sort of feathery antenna coming out of its head. The fruit fly down below, notice it has giant quote unquote antenna. This fruit fly on the bottom has a mutation in its Hox gene, and it's actually growing legs out of the top of its head instead of antenna. So now this is clearly not a helpful mutation in any way, and the fruit fly that has legs growing out of its head will probably not survive. But the point is that a mutation in a Hox gene can lead to these sudden changes, and that might be why we don't see in the fossil record exactly what Darwin had proposed, although we do sometimes. Why we don't always see that gradual transition. It could be, one possible answer is mutations in a Hox gene. So this is what the paragraph says. Researchers concluded that Hox genes are master regulators for the organization of the body. When the function of one of these genes is changed due to a genetic mutation or other factor, the wrong body part will develop in a given place. A fly, for example, might grow a leg in the middle of its head. All right, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.